From the Kray twins to Griselda Blanco, the world has seen its fair share of brutal gangsters. They rise from nothing, kill and maim their way to the top, and usually die in a horrific way that echoes their lives. Let's explore some of the most violent gangsters in history. Imagine being called
a monstrous symbol of a disease which was eating into the conscience of America.
Yep, this is Al Capone. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born on January 17, 1899 in Brooklyn, New York, to a family of Sicilian immigrants. His father, Gabriel, worked as a barber and was part of the massive influx of Italian immigrants who arrived in New York in the late 1890s. Al would be the fourth son of Gabriel and Teresa, and he would have 5 younger siblings too. From a young age, Al showed violent, impulsive behavior. Age 14, he was kicked out of school for punching a teacher. He never returned to school afterward. He wanted to make quick cash, and he knew he was going to go the illegal way to get it. He hated how Italian immigrants got the lower class neighborhoods in New York, while the likes of Rockefeller lived in palaces, were building skyscrapers, and enjoying 10-course meals. When he was 19, Al married a 21-year-old woman named May after she gave birth to their son, Albert. Pressed to make more money and support his family, Al got a job as a bookkeeper in Baltimore, but his ambitions were far larger. He worked as an enforcer for Chicago gangster Johnny Torrio, beating people up for extortion money. And when Johnny's mob boss died, he invited Al to Chicago to become an official part of his gang. This was all happening during Prohibition. Between 1919 and 1933, the U.S. banned the production, importation, transportation, and sale of alcohol. Needless to say, people didn't just stop drinking. In fact, they were more desperate than ever. Prohibition led to 2 things: several deaths due to toxic moonshine, and making Al Capone and his fellow gangsters billionaires. Al Capone played a Robin Hood role, saying,
"I'm just a businessman, giving the people what they want. All I do is satisfy a public demand."
But yeah, Al Capone wasn't just a businessman. He was a brutal killer, obsessed with removing his enemies and destroying anyone who looked at him the wrong way. One night in a Coney Island bar, Al complimented a woman's butt. The woman's brother was right there, and hearing this, he broke a bottle and slashed Al's face with it. This is how Al Capone got his nickname, Scarface, which would inspire the famous movie. His scarred face would match his criminal record. In Baltimore, he killed an illegal street worker for withholding money and a friend who reneged on a gambling debt. In Chicago, he was made head bouncer for the Four Deuces building, which had a bar, a brothel, and a few other questionable businesses owned by Johnny Torrio. During Capone's reign, a myriad of unsolved murders took place inside the building. Then, there was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. On February 14, 1929, Frank Gussenberg was rushed to a Chicago hospital with 14 gunshot wounds. But when the police asked him who shot him, he said, "No one." He was afraid to reveal Al Capone's involvement in the shootout. However, 3 hours later, he died anyway. Frank and 6 other members of George Bugs Moran's Northside gang had been lined up against a wall and scattered in a rain of gunfire, all arranged by Al Capone.
They ended up being greeted there by a bunch of guys in police uniforms. Bugs Moran was arriving. He saw the police car. He kept going.
The gangsters thought it was just cops coming to harass them and maybe try to get some money. And they said, "You guys are going to be transferred for this."
A lot of times they did that as show, law enforcement. So, they had to show that they arrested everybody, but naturally they got off later on. But they would publicize the arrest.
It wasn't cops. This was Al's way of eliminating rival gangs and establishing his monopoly on racketeering, bootlegging, extortion, and prostitution. Al was just 30 at the time. A year and a half later, he would be arrested for tax evasion. That's right, you might get away with murder, but don't try and fool the IRS.
They couldn't send the FBI into Chicago to get Al Capone because Prohibition was the Treasury agent's job.
By 1931, Al Capone had amassed a fortune of $100 million, $18.6 billion in today's money, and most of it was due to prostitution. Around the time he ended up behind the Alcatraz bars, Al started showing worrying signs of a disease. Remember how he oversaw a brothel, among other things? Well, he spent a lot of time there, outside business hours. He'd contracted syphilis, but was too ashamed to treat it. He would have risked the information getting out. In 1939, May Capone got her husband out of prison on physical and mental health grounds, but Al wouldn't get to rule an illegal empire for another minute. he lived his last years slowly losing his mind and his organs to the notorious illness.
There was an evaluation done that showed that he had the mental capacity of a 12-year-old. Well, 12-year-olds can be bright, but we are talking about quite a come down, quite a decline for a guy who'd essentially run the Chicago mob. So that being released from prison, he is still a prisoner.
Then, a stroke weakened his immune system even further, and he developed pneumonia just after his 48th birthday. He died from cardiac arrest. He was glorified and used as a symbol of mafia power in so many movies, but he was once the FBI's #1 enemy who took north of 200 lives just to preserve his bootlegging business. How did London's worst criminals come to hang out with Frank Sinatra and Judy Garland? In the 1950s, Ronnie and Reggie Kray were working-class military deserters who dreamed of becoming boxers. By the 1960s, they were West End celebrities. David Bailey wanted to photograph them, and they were invited for TV interviews.
How much does this trial cost you?
It's cost us roughly £8,000.
And how do you feel about that?
I don't suppose anyone likes the idea of spending that money for no reason at all, you know.
Does it leave you broke, or how does it leave you?
It doesn't leave us broke, but at the same time, it's a lot of money to have to pay out when money's innocent.
But the Kray twins had climbed the ranks of London society through arson, robbery, gambling, protection rackets, and even murder, as they led the notorious gang, the Firm. Reggie and Ronnie were born on October 24, 1933, 10 minutes apart from each other. They grew up in London's East End. At the time, filth, poverty, and murder dominated the area. The Ratcliffe Highway murders and Jack the Ripper still sent fear through the East Enders' veins, even by the mid-20th century. Age 15, the twins dropped out of school and started working at the local fish market. It was their first and last legitimate job. As a teenager, Reggie became a professional boxer, but Ronnie remained with the dream. Reggie was calculated and rational. Ronnie was like a bull in a china shop. His violent tendencies and his paranoid schizophrenic impulses were a match made in hell.
He was a very, very scary man. Believe me, I've met a lot of scary people, but Ronnie Kray was a very, very sick, psychopathical, schizophrenia, and manic depressive, all rolled in one word of his mouth. He meant everything he said.
On the first day of being drafted into the Army, Ronnie started a punch-up with the twins as sergeant. They were immediately arrested. In their early 20s, the Krays borrowed money from their older brother Charles and opened a pool hall in Bethnal Green. This was the gathering spot for all the sketchy men the twins had met in prison. Soon, it was a storage for stolen goods. In the mid-1950s, the three dockers invited the Kray twins to their pub for a drink. The twins knew this wasn't a friendly invitation. The dockers were an infamous gang at the time, and they were upset that the Krays were growing their business on their turf. But even though the brothers walked into a trap, they emerged victorious. When the pub's landlord returned, expecting to find the brothers passed out, he found the dockers unconscious on the floor, with Ronnie still punching one of them senseless. The twins slowly eliminated all gangster competition in East London, and soon enough, they were dominating the whole city.
It was a mixture of fear and respect. Respect because women and children, untouchable. Ordinary guys who went to work and that, untouchable. Any rows we had was only amongst ourselves. And if we hurt or killed one another, so what?
But that wasn't always true. Ronnie got up and shot a man for a very petty reason. Even Reggie was shocked. Sadly, Ronnie was causing more war between gangs than peace. He was in and out of prisons and mental institutions. In the late 1950s, Reggie bought his first West End bar, Emerald's Bar.
They took the East End to Knightsbridge. You know, all them ugly-looking with their cuts down their faces and all that, and flat noses, and they should have left the club as it was. But of course, they ruined the place, like they ruined everything, you know. Anyway, every club they had, the business they had, they ruined it.
After they opened the Double R Club, the Krays started mingling with the big stars. By the early 1960s, they were seen as the owners of a lush nightclub on the swinging London scene. Judy Garland, Shirley Bassey, and Frank Sinatra passed through their clubs, sharing drinks and jokes with the gangsters. When this wasn't happening, famed photographer David Bailey was immortalizing the brothers as two interesting characters from the London scene. But there was a problem. Everyone enjoying themselves was half at heart, in fear that Ronnie would go off.
I'd see people laughing and having a good time. If 5 minutes before he walked through the door. The minute he walked through the door, that laughter stopped. The conversation dimmed. People were terrified that he would say, "Are you laughing at me?" And then he had that paranoid feeling that they were laughing at him, and then there'd be a bloodbath.
In the mid-1960s, the Krays met a swift downfall. They were now at war with the Richardson gang. When one of the Krays' men was murdered in 1966, Ronnie retaliated by shooting the killer in broad daylight.
Cornell said, "Look who's here." But Ronnie didn't answer. He pulled out a Luger and shot Cornell through the forehead. Cornell slumped forward and eventually fell to the floor, where he died moments later.
So far, the twins had bribed the police to stay untouchable, but after this murder, the Met Police built a much stronger case against them. In 1967, Reggie killed his first and last man too, pressed by his mad dog brother. After both brothers were arrested, several of their men testified against them, afraid of what would happen if they were freed. They were sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 30 years before parole. This was the longest sentence given for murder in the UK at the time. After serving a few years in the same prison, the Krays were separated as Ronnie's schizophrenia was spiraling out of control. He spent 16 years at the Broadmoor Hospital, dying from a heart attack in March 1995. Reggie was released in August 2000 on compassionate grounds. He had terminal cancer and was allowed to live the last 5 weeks in freedom. They remain, to this day, Britain's most notorious gangsters. Al Capone inspired Scarface, and the Kray twins have their own movie. But James, or Jimmy Burke, is known as the gent behind Goodfellas. Jimmy Burke was born on July 5, 1931 in New York City, but he wasn't Italian or American for that matter. He was Irish, born to a single mother, Jane, who worked as an illegal street worker. When he was only 2, Jane abandoned him at a foster home, and he would spend his childhood in several abusive homes. Perhaps unsurprisingly, he was drawn to a life of crime, and, aged 18, he ended up in prison for a few years. That's where he met the Italian mafia families. Being Irish meant that he couldn't be a made man in the Italian mafia, but he could be their associate, so he partnered up with the Lucchese family. Somehow, being an outsider worked in his favor.
As an outsider, he could float around as a free agent, orchestrating crimes, heists and hits, getting away with almost anything.
Jimmy Burke became known as a well-dressed gent with a horrible penchant for violence. Yep, just like Robert De Niro in Goodfellas. Just a few days before his wedding to his lifelong wife, Mickey, Jimmy discovered that Mickey's ex-boyfriend was harassing her, and he had told a few friends about it. On his wedding day, Mickey's poor ex was found scattered about inside his car in a dozen pieces. Yeah, Jimmy wasn't one to just shoot you in the head. And then, there was Jimmy's biggest crime, the infamous Lufthansa heist, which at this time in 1978 was the largest cash robbery in American history. Jimmy Burke first began his plan several months before. Over dinner with a bookkeeper, his associate, Henry Hill, learned of a shocking arrangement that was taking place at New York's JFK airport. Once a month, millions of dollars in untraceable American currency would be flown into the airport, the result of monetary exchanges made for servicemen and tourists in West Germany. Once it arrived, via Lufthansa airplanes, it would be stored in a vault at JFK. A few years before, several airport employees had stolen $22,000 in foreign currency from Lufthansa. Jimmy learned this and paid them to orchestrate his massive heist. 6 Lucchese family men, Jimmy's own son, and one other member of the Gambino family performed the heist in just over an hour and got away with almost $6 million, just over $22 million by today's standards. Dozens were arrested and several people went to prison for it, but Jimmy was never caught or charged for the heist. Jimmy specialized in reselling stolen merchandise, untaxed liquor, and cigarettes. He also hijacked delivery trucks that went through Queens, but his greatest pleasure was bribing police officers to learn about informants. He had a thirst for blood, shocking even to the Lucchese family. He even killed his close friend Ramon Cassani after he found out he had a double life as a police informant. Jimmy would destroy his victims, then kidnap their children and lock them inside refrigerators. Their parents would be strangled with piano wire and shot, dismembered, or crushed with car crusher cranes. And he didn't just kill informants. It could even be someone who said something that bothered him. According to Henry Hill, Jimmy Burke was directly responsible for at least 70 murders, though those are the only ones Henry knew about. One might venture to say Jimmy was punishing his childhood abusers whenever he would pour his rage onto the people who looked at him the wrong way or insulted him in a bar. In 1982, Henry Hill became an FBI informant and helped them arrest Jimmy. He was never convicted for the Lufthansa heist, though, and was only sentenced to 20 years in prison. In 1998, however, he succumbed to lung cancer in prison. We often think of big, burly men with scars on their face when we imagine violent gangsters. But what if I told you there was a female gangster so tough, she killed her 3 husbands and scared all of her male sicarios? Griselda Blanco, born in Colombia in 1943. Not much is known about her first years at home, but Griselda was shockingly young when she entered the criminal world. She was 11 years old when she attempted the kidnapping and ransom of a young boy from a rich family. When the family failed to pay, she killed the boy. You might think Griselda was a bad seed with a hot temper, but this level of violence is seldom innate. Griselda grew up with an unstable mom and her abusive boyfriend, who would violate Griselda repeatedly. When she was 19 years old, she ran away from home and settled in Medellin. That's right, Pablo Escobar's hometown. But Griselda and Pablo would be enemies, not cartel buddies. During the 1970s, Griselda illegally immigrated to the US and settled in New York. Then she moved to Miami, sensing the urge and white powder consumption in the area. From there, she would oversee the Medellin's notorious smuggling. During the 1970s and 80s, white powder was trafficked more than weed, and Griselda was at the center of the terrible Miami war. Police officers were being gunned down in the middle of the day, and rival gangs would engage in shootouts in public places, endangering civilian lives on a daily basis. It was like the Wild West in the 1970s US.
The disregard for human life there at the scene, and something that we had never seen or heard of here in South Florida.
What was even more shocking was who was ordering these shootouts. Griselda was a 5-foot-tall mother of 4. Seeing her, you really didn't think cruel Lord. But she had a thirst for blood equaled by none. Griselda is responsible for anywhere between 40 and 200 deaths. As is the case with violent gangsters, these were enemy cartel members, officers, people who looked at her the wrong way, and even her own lovers. Griselda murdered all 3 husbands. The first to go was a petty forger named Carlos Trujillo after a business dispute. Then she killed her second husband, Alberto Bravo, after she suspected him of cheating on her. Yep, she suspected him on a hunch. There's always divorce, Griselda. In 1983, she killed her last husband after he left her, but not before butchering 8 strippers she thought were sleeping with him. And to make matters even worse, she had a German shepherd called Hitler. She was a horrible dictator and was proud of it. She was also proud of her nickname, the Black Widow. She even designed her own assassination method, the motorbike drive-by. At her career peak, Griselda was making $8 million a month. She had created a special line of lingerie and hid white powder in the secret sewings that women wore past the borders. At the time, it was a pretty revolutionary method. Women were less likely to be randomly checked in airports, and she knew that. She even trained her women smugglers to flirt with the guards and distract them.
They were creating garments. These garments would allow for to be more smoothed around the body. It would just look like a woman's natural figure. She encouraged the women to dress very attractively, to be flirtatious with customs agents and immigration agents.
The Black Widow had a career as shocking as her personal lifestyle. She would host fueled by sexual orgies and changed her appearance dramatically according to her mood. If she felt powerful, she would look like the femme fatale. If she became paranoid about rival cartels being out to get her, she wouldn't groom for days, looking like a scary witch. After a decade-long operation, the DEA finally arrested Griselda on February 17, 1985. The agent in charge was so happy that he kissed Griselda on the cheek.
Bob went directly up to Griselda and gave her a big kiss on the cheek. She demanded to know, "What is that for?" Which Bob replied, "That's because I'm so glad to see you." Because Bob had been hunting her for a decade.
She was charged with conspiring to manufacture, import, and distribute coke and sentenced to 15 years. Even at the peak of Pablo Escobar's empire, the violence in the US plummeted after Griselda was put behind bars.
The fact that the homicide rate dropped dramatically after she was arrested.
And now, karma was coming back to the Black Widow. 3 of her sons were killed, and her surviving child, Michael, survived 7 assassination attempts. In 2004, Griselda was released and deported to Colombia. In 2012, age 69, Griselda was visiting a butcher shop with her pregnant daughter-in-law when 2 hired assassins jumped off their motorbikes and shot her twice in the head. A brutal death for a brutal gangster. Here's a man who once tested his gun on a pedestrian, killing him on the spot. Ramon Ariano Felix was born in 1964 in Sinaloa, Mexico, 12 years younger than his brother Benjamin. The 2 brothers began working for their uncle, Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, aka El Padrino, the leader of the Guadalajara cartel. Side note, around this time, El Chapo was doing the same thing. After El Padrino was arrested in 1989, the Guadalajara cartel crumbled into 3 smaller cartels, Tijuana, Sinaloa, and Juarez. The Tijuana cartel was also called the Ariano Felix cartel because it was controlled by Benjamin and Ramon and their extended family. In fact, their sister Anadina still rules the Tijuana cartel. She is one of the most successful cartel queenpins and fugitives to date. Back to Ramon. His older brother Benjamin was the rational kingpin, overseeing production, smuggling, and bribing. But Ramon, well, he was Benjamin's 6'2", 220-pound mad dog. He was the cartel's brutal enforcer, but he was so violent that he often went against Benjamin's policy and he or killed anyone he felt like. He literally became known as the brutal enforcer. That was a nickname among sicarios who were already brutal. Ramon then created his own army of violent men. He even had a wing for terrifying teens, and he would groom them to become true psychopathic killers.
You've got a guy on the ground who's injured, who's basically begging not to be killed.
Right. Yeah, he's begging for his life. No me mates, don't kill me. When he was begging for his life, I did say, this is for Ramon Ariano. I wanted him to know why he was dying.
Revenge for an attempted hit on his cartel bosses, the Ariano brothers.
During the 1980s, the Mexican authorities were desperate to arrest Ramon. He killed a pregnant woman who he thought was an informant, and he even killed her sister for absolutely no reason.
In San Diego, he shot a pregnant woman suspected of talking to the cops, along with her sister, a fashion model.
Their number came up, and unfortunately, it was time for them to go.
Reason isn't gangsters' forte. Ramon's main purpose was to spread fear and the message that no one should mess with him. This eventually brought Ramon's end in just as brutal of a way. One of the people Ramon became angry at was El Chapo. By the late 1980s, he was already a feared kingpin. He had the Sinaloa cartel behind him. El Chapo had given the Ariano Felix brother a partnership offer, but the brothers found him too young and inexperienced at the time. So he sent over this man, El Rayo Lopez, to negotiate. But El Chapo didn't know Ramon couldn't be negotiated with. Ramon got angry and shot El Rayo in the head. El Chapo would try to assassinate the brothers many times after this incident. It was El Chapo, not the police, that had the brothers on the run. Ramon spent the better half of the 1990s in the US undercover. In fact, he went so deep undercover and took on such an exaggerated American costume that he attracted the attention of David Letterman's Late Show prankster.
Excuse me. Excuse me. Are you Michael Jordan? Are you Michael Jordan? Huh? Huh? Oh, he speaks Spanish. Oh. Michael? Hey, Michael? Here you go. Tickets to Showgirls.
Hey, everybody, it's Michael Jordan. Look, everybody, it's Michael Jordan. Look.
He was a character, but he was ruthless. I can tell you firsthand that he didn't have a conscience.
David Letterman was talking to this man via headset, telling him what to tell Ramon. Neither of them knew that they were trying to prank one of the FBI's 10 most wanted. In 2002, Ramon came back to Mazatlan, Sinaloa, perhaps on a temporary visit. When he ignored a traffic light, a police stopped his car. The officer had barely made it to Ramon's car when Ramon pulled out his gun. Within a matter of seconds, both men shot each other fatally. The catch? The police officer had been hired by El Chapo to track Ramon down and kill him at the first chance. If you haven't heard of Simeon Gavrilevich, this only makes him scarier, because today, he is known as the world's most powerful gangster.
He's been accused of everything from buying an entire airline just for trafficking to selling nuclear weapons. Yet somehow Simeon Gavrilevich lives free.
Simeon Gavrilevich was born on June 30th, 1946 in Kiev, Ukraine, which at the time was part of the Soviet Union. Sometime in the 1990s, Gavrilevich became the leader of Russia's Red Mafia, or Bratva, a notorious, terrifying organization charged with pretty much every crime on earth. Here are some of Simeon's charges: racketeering, money laundering, mail fraud, fraud by wire, arms trafficking, drug trafficking, human trafficking, smuggling, prostitution, and murder. Yeah, some of them. He never cared for another human being. He was born to a Jewish family, yet he began his life of crime by scamming fellow Jewish people, most of them looking to immigrate outside of the Soviet Union. Simeon made deals to purchase their assets, sell them for fair market value, and forward the proceeds. Instead, he simply sold the assets and pocketed the proceeds. In the 1990s, he even started dabbling in nuclear weapons trading. He once tried to broker a deal to dump American toxic waste in the Chernobyl region. He was thus named an existential threat to Israel and Europe. Needless to say, Simeon didn't get to the top of the Red Mafia with just his economics degree. He was known for extreme brutality. His enforcer army was made of Afghan war veterans. They mutilated enemies and associates so brutally that other Russian crime groups quietly disappeared.
People are much more afraid of the Russian mafia than they are of even the Colombians, the American mafia, or the Sicilians and Italian mafia. He is affiliated with the most powerful criminal organization operating in Russia today.
What is your business?
For the past few years, I've been selling and Kray.
In 1993, Simeon and the Solontsevskaya crime family acquired a jewelry business in Moscow and Hungary, which became a front for jewelry, antiques, and art acquisitions that they had stolen from Russian churches and museums. In 1994, Simeon bought a license to buy and sell weapons. He ended up buying most of Hungary's arms industry. Mortar, anti-aircraft gun factories, artillery shell, and fire equipment manufacturers were now his. Then he bought a bankrupt airline from a former Central Asian Soviet republic for millions of dollars in cash to traffic heroin out of the Golden Triangle. He controlled everything that went into Moscow's international airport. So how is he still not in prison? By the mid-1990s, the FBI began to track Simeon in a $150 million scheme to defraud thousands of investors in a Canadian company, YBM Magnex, which was based just outside of Philadelphia and supposedly made magnets. But Simeon was a master money launderer. Craig Unger wrote,
"He mastered a skill that was deeply coveted by the most formidable gangsters on the planet. He took dirty money and made it clean."
Simeon had another crazy tactic. He gives the Hungarian police and German Federal Intelligence Service information about rival gangs. This way, he looks cooperative and protects himself from being investigated by other European countries. Meanwhile, Simeon stays very close to all Russian mafias and the Italian Camorra. When he isn't making friends with the police, he secures horrifying deals and maintains his prized torture chamber in his lavish Prague headquarters. In 2008, Simeon was finally arrested on tax evasion charges, but a year later, he was released on bail. To this day, he remains on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, but he's linked with so many top political figures, from Donald Trump to Vladimir Putin, that it's unlikely he will ever be arrested. Every time he is confronted about his crimes, he blatantly denies involvement.
You are said to be a financier who runs prostitution, gambling, and money laundering. Would your own people, the Russians, say this if it is not true?
These are just words. They don't have documents proving that. And the people saying it understand nothing. In England you did this, in America you did this. I could say either yes, that did happen, or no, it didn't. They're saying these things exist. How can you prove they don't? None of it happened. How can you explain that none of it happened? Well, how do you explain it? It's impossible to explain it.
This is a stark reminder of the powers of the criminal underworld and dangerous network we only catch glimpses of. Who knows what is really happening behind closed doors? Hey, thanks for watching. What are your thoughts on today's video? What other brutal gangsters do you know? Let me know in the comments section. And before you leave, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you all next time.